Settle in, turn down the lights, and listen closely. Tonight, we have three quiet terrors from listeners, shared for Halloween. Our first tale comes from a listener who was 8 years old when Halloween changed for them forever. They write about that particular quality of childhood Halloween nights, when the world transforms into something both magical and unsettling. The familiar streets of your neighborhood become pathways to the unknown. The houses you pass every day suddenly hold secrets behind their darkened windows. This is the common thread that runs through tonight's stories. The familiar becoming unfamiliar. The safe spaces of our daily lives revealing hidden depths when darkness falls and the veil between worlds grows thin. Picture a quiet suburban neighborhood in the Midwest. The kind of place where children ride bicycles on sidewalks and neighbors wave from their front porches. But this is Halloween night, and the rules have changed. The streetlights cast longer shadows. The wind carries sounds that might be laughter, or might be something else entirely. Our listener had spent the evening trick-or-treating with friends, moving from house to house in the comfortable rhythm of childhood Halloween. Costumes rustling, candy bags growing heavier, the excitement of each doorbell, and each handful of treats dropped into waiting bags. But as the night wore on, and the other children were called home by their parents, they found themselves alone on a street they thought they knew. This is where the story begins to shift from memory into something deeper. The emotional weight of what happened that night still haunts them, decades later. They describe it as the moment when they first understood that the world held spaces of genuine mystery, places where the normal rules simply didn't apply. This is where the story begins. The emotional weight of what happened that night still haunts them, decades later. The first story, the last house on the lane. The house stood apart from the others on the street, set back behind an overgrown hedge that had seen better days. During daylight hours, it was just another home in the neighborhood, perhaps a bit more weathered than the rest, with paint that had faded and a lawn that grew a little too wild. But in the darkness of Halloween night, it seemed to exist in its own pocket of shadow. Our listener approached the front gate, candy bag rustling softly in the still air. The porch light was off, but that single upstairs window glowed with a warm, inviting light. Perhaps the residents were simply late to join the Halloween festivities. Perhaps they had candy waiting and had simply forgotten to turn on their porch light. The gate creaked as it opened, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet night. The walkway was cracked and uneven, with weeds pushing up through the concrete. Each step felt deliberate, purposeful, as if the house itself was drawing them forward. But before they could reach the porch steps, before they could knock or ring the doorbell, something extraordinary happened. The front door opened. Not quickly, not dramatically. It opened slowly, quietly, with the soft whisper of hinges that needed oil. Beyond the doorway lay an empty hallway, lit by a light source that couldn't quite be identified. The hallway stretched back into the house, lined with doors that stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Our listeners stood frozen on the walkway, candy bag forgotten in their grip. No one had answered the door. No friendly adult face appeared to greet them. The door had simply opened, as if the house itself had decided to welcome them inside. The sensation of being watched crept over them like a chill. Not the comfortable feeling of friendly observation, but something else entirely. Something that made the hair on their arms stand up and their breath catch in their throat. Slowly, carefully, they lifted their eyes to that upstairs window. A face looked back at them. Not clearly, not distinctly. Just the suggestion of features behind the glass, pale and indistinct in the warm light. The face of someone standing very still, very quiet, watching the child on the walkway below. Watching and waiting. Our listener's attention was drawn back to the porch by a soft sound, like paper rustling in the wind. There on the porch steps sat a large ceramic bowl, the kind typically used for Halloween candy. But as they moved closer, squinting in the dim light that spilled from the open doorway, they realized the bowl wasn't filled with wrapped chocolates or colorful hard candies. The bowl was filled with teeth. Not candy shaped like teeth, not plastic novelty items. Real teeth, yellowed with age, some still bearing traces of old fillings. They lay in the bowl like grotesque pearls, catching what little light there was and reflecting it back with a dull gleam. The emotional turn came then, swift and devastating. The face in the upstairs window moved closer to the glass, and in that moment of clearer visibility, our listener recognized the features. Mrs. Henderson, who had lived in the house until 3 years ago. Mrs. Henderson, who had moved away to live with her daughter in another state. Mrs. Henderson, who had always given out full-size candy bars and remembered every child's name. But Mrs. Henderson looked different now. Her face was too pale, her eyes too dark, and when she smiled, our listener could see the gaps where her teeth had been. The quiet escape began then, not with running or screaming, but with the careful, deliberate steps of a child who understood instinctively that sudden movements might attract unwanted attention. They backed away from the porch, away from the open door and the bowl of teeth, keeping their eyes fixed on that upstairs window where Mrs. Henderson continued to watch. The front gate seemed much farther away than it had when they'd entered. Each step backward felt like an eternity, each breath too loud in the still air. The feeling of being followed grew stronger with every moment, not by footsteps or visible pursuit, but by the weight of attention, the sensation of eyes tracking their movement. When they finally reached the sidewalk and turned toward home, they could still feel that gaze upon them. Not just from the upstairs window now, but from the open doorway, from the shadows between the houses, from the darkness that seemed to have grown deeper and more present since their visit to the house at the end of the lane. The walk home passed in a blur of streetlights and familiar landmarks that no longer felt quite as familiar as they had an hour before. The candy bag felt heavier now, though they hadn't added anything to it. Their costume, which had felt so perfect earlier in the evening, now seemed inadequate protection against the things that moved in the darkness between the pools of lamplight. At home, safe behind locked doors and bright electric lights, they tried to tell their parents about what they had seen. But how do you explain the feeling of a house opening itself to you? How do you describe the weight of attention from someone who shouldn't have been there? How do you make adults understand that the bowl of teeth was real? That Mrs. Henderson's gap-toothed smile was an invitation to something far worse than trick-or-treating? The lingering question haunted them for years afterward, surfacing every October as Halloween approached. What was truly in that house? Was Mrs. Henderson really standing at that upstairs window? Or was it something else wearing her face? And most disturbing of all, what would have happened if they had accepted the house's invitation and stepped through that open doorway into the empty hallway beyond? They never found out what happened to the real Mrs. Henderson. Attempts to contact her daughter in later years led nowhere. The house at the end of the lane was sold within a year of that Halloween night, bought by a young family who painted the exterior and planted new flowers in the garden. But our listener never walked past it again without remembering the weight of those watching eyes and the sound of that door opening in the darkness. Some invitations, they learned that night, are better left unanswered. Some doors are better left unopened. And some Halloween nights reveal truths about the world that we spend the rest of our lives trying to forget. But wait, there is another layer to this darkness we must explore together. As that first story drifts away into the quiet corners of memory, another listener's voice emerges from the shadows, carrying with it a different Halloween, a different terror, but the same unsettling feeling that the world we know can shift without warning. This second account comes from someone who experienced their quiet terror, not as a child wandering suburban streets, but as a college student surrounded by friends and laughter. The setting was different, the age was different, but the theme remains constant. Something hidden in plain sight, something that waits for just the right moment to reveal itself. Halloween parties have their own particular energy, don't they? The forced merriment, the costumes that let people become someone else for a night, the way alcohol and darkness can make even the most rational person believe in things they would dismiss in daylight. But sometimes, in the midst of all that artificial celebration, something genuinely unsettling finds its way into the festivities. Our second listener learned this lesson in the most personal way possible. They discovered that sometimes the mask we put on for Halloween doesn't want to come off. Sometimes what we think is just costume becomes something far more permanent, far more transformative than we ever intended. As the first story drifts onward into the quiet spaces of your mind, let it settle there gently while we prepare for the next tale. This one will take us deeper into the question of identity, of what happens when the line between who we are and who we pretend to be begins to blur beyond recognition. The second story, the mask that wouldn't come off. The party was everything a college Halloween celebration should be. Loud music pounding through the speakers, colored lights casting shifting patterns on the walls, and students packed into every corner of the off-campus house, their costumes ranging from elaborate to last-minute creative. The air was thick with laughter, conversation, and the sweet smell of spilled drinks, mixing with autumn air drifting through open windows. Our listener had arrived wearing what they thought was the perfect costume. Simple, effective, and cheap enough for a college budget. A plain white plastic mask, the kind you might find in any party store, with basic features molded into its surface. Nothing elaborate, nothing expensive. Just a blank face to hide behind while they enjoyed the anonymity that Halloween provides. The mask fit well at first, sitting comfortably against their skin with the elastic band holding it securely in place. They moved through the party easily, dancing, talking, laughing with friends who didn't immediately recognize them behind the featureless white surface. It was exactly what they had hoped for, a chance to be someone else, or perhaps no one at all, for just one night. But as the evening progressed, something began to change. The mask, which had felt light and comfortable when they first put it on, began to feel different against their skin. Not heavier exactly, but more present, more connected to their face than a simple plastic barrier should be. At first, they attributed the sensation to the heat and humidity of the crowded party. Masks can become uncomfortable when worn for extended periods, especially in warm, crowded spaces. The plastic can stick to skin that's grown damp with perspiration. It's a normal part of wearing any kind of face covering for too long. But this was different. The mask wasn't just sticking to their skin, it was adhering to it, becoming part of it in a way that felt far too intimate, far too permanent.
When they reached up to adjust it, expecting their fingers to find the familiar edge where plastic met flesh, they found instead a seamless transition, as if the mask had grown into their face rather than simply resting upon it. The first real moment of panic came when they tried to remove it entirely. Standing in a corner of the living room, surrounded by the chaos of the party, they reached behind their head to find the elastic band that should have held the mask in place. Their fingers found nothing. No band, no ties, no visible means of attachment. The mask had somehow become their face, and their face had become the mask. The panic was muted by the loud music and the press of bodies around them. No one noticed their growing distress because the mask showed no expression, revealed no emotion. They were trapped behind that blank white surface, unable to communicate their fear to the friends who continued to laugh and dance just inches away. They pushed through the crowd toward the bathroom, desperate for privacy and a mirror where they could examine what was happening to them. But the hallway seemed longer than it should have been, and the faces of the other partygoers began to look strange and distorted, as if they too were wearing masks that had fused with their skin. In the bathroom, under the harsh fluorescent light, they finally got a clear look at what they had become. The mask stared back at them from the mirror, but it was no longer the simple white plastic they had purchased. The features were changing, becoming more detailed, more realistic. The blank eye holes now showed their own eyes, but the shape around them had shifted, becoming more angular, more alien.
The mouth, which had been just a simple opening in the plastic, was now a complex structure with what looked like lips, but lips that didn't quite match the shape of their own. When they tried to speak, the words came out muffled and strange, as if the mask was interpreting their voice, rather than simply allowing it to pass through. The emotional depth of what was happening began to sink in then. This wasn't just a costume malfunction or a panic attack brought on by too much alcohol and too little sleep. This was a fundamental transformation, a loss of identity that went deeper than anything they had ever imagined possible. They were becoming someone else, or perhaps something else, and there seemed to be no way to reverse the process. The worst part was the isolation. Surrounded by friends and fellow students, trapped in a crowded party where everyone was celebrating and having fun, they were utterly alone with their terror. The mask made it impossible for anyone to see their distress, impossible for them to communicate what was happening. They had become a stranger in their own body, wearing a face that was no longer their own. They spent what felt like hours in that bathroom, staring at their reflection and trying to understand what was happening to them. The mask continued to change, its features becoming more defined, more personal. It was as if it was learning from their face, copying their expressions and mannerisms, but interpreting them through its own alien understanding of human features. The music from the party continued to pound through the thin walls, a constant reminder of the normal world that existed just beyond the bathroom door. A world where people wore costumes that came off at the end of the night, where masks were just masks, and faces remained faces. A world they were no longer sure they belonged to. When they finally emerged from the bathroom, the party was beginning to wind down. Some guests had already left, and others were gathering their things and saying their goodbyes. They moved through the remaining crowd like a ghost, their transformed face drawing no attention because everyone expected to see costumes and masks on Halloween night. The walk back to their dorm room was a journey through a world that no longer felt familiar. Streetlights cast different shadows when seen through the eye holes of a mask that had become part of their flesh. Other students they passed looked strange and distorted, as if their own faces were masks that might at any moment reveal something else beneath. In their room, alone at last, they sat before their small mirror and tried once more to remove what had once been a simple plastic mask. But there was nothing to remove anymore. The mask had become their face, and their face had become something they no longer recognized. The features continued to shift and change, settling into a configuration that was neither fully human nor entirely other. The final, quiet terror came with acceptance. Not the peaceful acceptance of something understood and embraced, but the hollow acceptance of something that could not be changed or undone. They would wake up tomorrow with this new face, would go to classes and interact with friends and family while wearing features that belonged to someone or something else. The mask had won. It had found a face to call home, and it had no intention of leaving. They were still themselves inside, still had their memories and thoughts and feelings, but they would experience the world forever through the eye holes of something that had once been just a costume, just a simple piece of plastic meant to last for one night of fun. Halloween had given them exactly what they thought they wanted: a new face, a new identity, a chance to be someone else. They had simply never considered that the change might be permanent, or that the someone else they became might not be entirely human. These stories share a thread of transformation that runs deeper than simple Halloween scares. They speak to something fundamental about the nature of fear itself, the way it can reshape not just our understanding of the world, but our understanding of ourselves. The Halloween night serves as a catalyst for the hidden to surface, for the things that normally remain buried beneath the comfortable routines of daily life to reveal themselves. It's as if the darkness and the costumes and the celebration give permission for reality to bend, for the impossible to become possible, if only for a few hours. But what happens when those few hours stretch into something longer? What happens when the transformation that was supposed to be temporary becomes permanent? Our first two listeners discovered that Halloween doesn't always play by the rules we expect. Sometimes the mask doesn't come off. Sometimes the door that opens can't be closed again. Moving deeper into the final and perhaps most personal account, we shift from external fears to an internal haunting. This last story comes from someone who thought they were in control, who believed they could invite the darkness in and then send it away when the game was over. They learned that some guests, once invited, have no intention of leaving. The apartment was new, the friends were trusted, and the mirror in the bathroom seemed like just another piece of furniture. But mirrors have their own relationship with Halloween night, their own way of reflecting more than just the faces that look into them. Sometimes they show us things we weren't meant to see. Sometimes they become doorways for things that weren't meant to enter our world. The third story: the uninvited guest. The apartment still smelled like fresh paint and new carpet when our final listener decided to host their first Halloween party. They had just moved in 2 weeks earlier, excited to have their own space after years of shared dorms and cramped student housing. The rooms were small but cozy, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light during the day and created interesting shadows when darkness fell. They had invited a dozen close friends, people they had known for years and trusted completely. The kind of gathering where everyone feels comfortable, where the conversation flows easily and the laughter comes naturally. Pumpkins carved with silly faces lined the windowsills. Orange and black streamers hung from the ceiling, and a playlist of classic Halloween songs provided the perfect background atmosphere. The party was everything they had hoped it would be. Friends arrived in creative costumes, bringing homemade treats and bottles of wine to share. The small apartment filled with warmth and conversation, the kind of intimate gathering that makes you feel grateful for the people in your life. Everyone was relaxed, happy to be together, enjoying the simple pleasure of good company on a night dedicated to harmless scares and playful frights. It was Sarah, dressed as a vintage witch complete with pointed hat and flowing black dress, who suggested the game. She had been telling stories about her grandmother's old house, about the superstitions and folk beliefs that had been passed down through generations of women in her family. The conversation had turned to mirrors and their supposed supernatural properties, the old beliefs about what they could show and what they could hide. "We should try Bloody Mary," Sarah suggested with a laugh, her eyes bright with wine and mischief. "I mean, we're all adults here. What's the worst that could happen?" The suggestion was met with a mixture of nervous laughter and genuine interest. Everyone knew the game, had heard the stories since childhood about what happened when you stood in a dark bathroom, looked into a mirror, and called that name 3 times. Most had tried it themselves at sleepovers and summer camps, with results that ranged from disappointing to mildly unsettling. Our listener felt a moment of hesitation. Something about the idea didn't sit right with them, though they couldn't articulate why. The apartment was new to them, unfamiliar in the way that all new spaces remain slightly foreign until you've lived in them long enough to make them truly yours. But the enthusiasm of their friends was infectious, and they didn't want to be the one to spoil the fun. The bathroom was small and windowless, lit by a single overhead fixture that cast harsh shadows in the corners. The mirror above the sink was large and old, one of the few things the previous tenant had left behind. During the day, it reflected light beautifully, making the small space feel larger and brighter. But in the dim light of evening, with most of the apartment's lamps turned low for atmosphere, it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They gathered in the bathroom doorway, 8 friends crowding together to watch as our listener stood before the mirror. The overhead light was switched off, leaving only the faint glow from the living room to illuminate the space. In the dim light, their reflection was barely visible, just a vague shape against the darker background of the mirror's surface. The first, Bloody Mary, came out as barely a whisper, spoken more to satisfy their friends than from any real belief in the ritual's power. The second was slightly louder, delivered with the kind of theatrical emphasis that gets laughs at parties. But as they prepared to speak the name for the third and final time, something in the mirror caught their attention. The reflection looking back at them wasn't quite right. Not dramatically different, not obviously wrong, but subtly altered in ways that made their breath catch in their throat. The face in the mirror seemed slightly fuller, the eyes a bit wider, the mouth curved in an expression they weren't making. It was still recognizably them, but like a photograph that had been subtly edited, adjusted in ways that were almost imperceptible, but somehow deeply unsettling. The third Bloody Mary died on their lips as the bathroom light began to flicker. Not the dramatic strobing of a horror movie, but the subtle, irregular flutter of a fluorescent bulb that's beginning to fail. In the uncertain light, their reflection seemed to move independently, turning its head slightly to look at something beyond the range of the mirror's surface. The laughter from their friends stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was so complete that our listener could hear their own heartbeat, could hear the soft whisper of their breath in the still air. Behind them, in the doorway, their friends had gone very quiet, their faces pale in the dim light from the living room. But it was the feeling of a third presence that truly frightened them. Not visible in the mirror, not reflected in the glass, but undeniably there in the small bathroom with them. Something that stood just behind their left shoulder, close enough that they should have been able to feel its breath on their neck, close enough that they should have been able to sense its warmth or hear the rustle of its clothing. The party continued in the living room, but our listener remained frozen before the mirror, trapped in a growing silence that seemed to expand around them like a living thing. Their friends had returned to their conversations and their drinks, but the laughter sounded forced now, artificial in a way that made it clear everyone was trying too hard to pretend nothing had happened. The feeling of being watched intensified with each passing moment. Not just watched, but studied. examined by something that was learning about them through careful observation. The presence behind their shoulder seemed to be taking notes, cataloging details about their appearance and mannerisms for some unknown purpose. The emotional depth of being a stranger in your own home, watched by an unseen guest, began to sink in then. This was supposed to be their sanctuary, their private space where they could relax and be themselves. But something had been invited in, something that had no intention of leaving when the party ended and the friends went home. They tried to step away from the mirror, to break the connection that seemed to have formed between themselves and whatever was looking back at them from the glass. But their feet felt rooted to the bathroom floor, held in place by an invisible force that was gentle, but absolutely unyielding. The decision to break the mirror came suddenly, born from desperation rather than courage. They grabbed a heavy ceramic soap dispenser from the counter and swung it hard against the glass surface. The mirror shattered with a sound like breaking ice, sending fragments cascading into the sink and onto the floor around their feet. But behind the broken mirror, where there should have been a wall, was empty space. A void that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of the apartment. A darkness so complete that it seemed to absorb the light from the room behind them. And in that darkness, just visible at the very edge of perception, was a face that looked exactly like their own, smiling with an expression they had never worn, reaching out with hands that cast no shadow in the dim light. The uninvited guest had found a way in, and the broken mirror had become a doorway rather than a barrier. Halloween night had delivered exactly what the ritual had promised, but not in any way they had expected or wanted. The game was over, but the consequences were just beginning. 3 Halloweens, 3 quiet terrors, each one revealing the same fundamental truth about the world we think we know. The familiar can become unfamiliar in the space of a heartbeat. The safe spaces of our daily lives can transform into something else entirely when darkness falls and the boundaries between worlds grow thin. Each of our listeners discovered that Halloween night doesn't simply celebrate the supernatural, it invites it in. The child at the last house learned that some doors open without invitation, revealing spaces that shouldn't exist. The college student found that masks can become more than costume, more than pretense. Our final storyteller discovered that mirrors reflect more than just our faces, that some reflections have lives of their own. These moments of fear leave a lasting imprint on those who experience them, not just as memories to be recalled and shared, but as fundamental shifts in understanding. Once you've seen the world bend and change around you, once you've felt the presence of something that shouldn't exist, you can never quite return to the comfortable certainty of before. The common thread isn't the supernatural elements themselves, but the recognition that the world holds depths we rarely glimpse. Halloween simply provides the permission, the cultural framework, for these hidden layers to surface. A final moment of stillness settles over us now as these 3 tales find their place in the quiet darkness of your mind. If this quiet terror helped you relax, consider subscribing for more gentle journeys into the darkness. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next quiet hour.